Well, I actually worked for the U.S. government for quite some time, but then after that, and after doing my higher education in Europe, I worked for an NGO doing economic development in conflict zones, particularly in the Middle East, and that led me into focusing on, particularly on financial inclusion. We did a lot of work with microfinance, and then that led me into working on impact investing, particularly around fintech startups. And so then I started working with fintech startups all around the Middle East. Then after that, realizing that in order for not just nonprofits, but fintech startups to actually reach the last mile, there was a gap in terms of how do we actually get there. And that's when I started becoming more interested in payment systems, and particularly mobile money, which was the most successful way of reaching the last mile. So then I started working in mobile money in Southeast Asia. And then after working in mobile money, realizing that there are still limits on how much a single mobile money company can do without being included in larger interoperability discussions. And so that's when I got very passionate about focusing on payment networks and interoperability of them while working with Mojaloop. I think if we're talking about financial inclusion, I mean, this is one of the things of having worked for all of these different types, and there's lots of different lessons everyone can learn, but having worked for so many different types of organizations that have different business models themselves, who are all working on financial inclusion, whether you're talking about donors and governments, foundations, or nonprofits that are intermediaries, or payment system consultants, or mobile money, or banks, or microfinance. And then there's several different types of microfinance, and then different government regulators. All of them have different agendas and different objectives. And in order for a payment system, in order for us to achieve interoperability, in order for us to achieve financial inclusion, all of those different types of institutions have to accept that they have different business models and different objectives, and that's fine. But I think there is some reality setting that different organizations need to realize that others have different objectives, and that's okay. So what I would say is more cross-stakeholder communication and understanding would be great. For example, it'd be great if the MFIs, or sorry, the nonprofits tried much harder to understand the business model of mobile money. And it'd be great if mobile money would understand how donors work, and particularly great if donors would understand also how mobile money works and how businesses work, so as to provide probably better targeted incentives to drive industries in certain directions. So more cross-stakeholder communication and trust building, I think, would be very effective. First, how do we define interoperability? I mean, first and foremost, it's not an on-off switch. There isn't, this is interoperable and this is not interoperable. It's a spectrum with a number of different variables that should each be measured to understand how interoperable something is. So one thing you would want to measure is how does the client experience interoperability? So for example, is it possible for me to send money from my account at one institution to your account at a different institution? Possible. Is that interoperable? Yes. But is it hidden in the deep pages of my banking app so that I can never find it? Well, that's not really a very good example of interoperability. So obviously, when it comes to the client's perspective, like the ultimate great example of interoperability would be if it's completely seamless and easy, but that's not the only definition of interoperability. So within that variable of how does the client experience, there can be a spectrum. And it's the same when you're talking about interoperability of financial institutions or their ability to participate. Now, obviously, if two financial institutions get together and they interoperate with each other, you could consider that a type of interoperability, but it's not as good as if there was 3 financial institutions. And that's not as good as if there were 4 and 5 and so on and so on. So at what point do you say this system is interoperable? Is it when 100% of the financial institutions have joined? That's not really feasible because it's not always easy for a financial institution to join a payment system. So you can't make that again, an on-off switch. And so there you again have to talk about a spectrum. I would say if there are 20 banks in their country and only 3 are connected, then you're probably not interoperable. But if you have 15 connected, then I think you're probably doing quite well. If you start talking about non-banks, especially in a lot of countries, and I'll get into this in a sec, then you're doing even better. So I'd say those are the types of things that I would measure as, is this system interoperable? Is how many accounts in a country are able to connect and transact seamlessly from different financial institutions. Let me tie that into the question you mentioned on the difference of Europe and the US versus Asia and Africa. In Europe and the US, most interoperability and previous interoperability schemes like Visa and MasterCard have really focused on banked bank accounts and banked clients and the interoperability of banks. Whereas in Asia and Africa, there are a lot of clients that are not using banks and are never going to use banks. And the transactions that banks are wanting to drive are not necessarily going to be the ones that non-banked or underbanked clients want. And so I think when we're talking about Asia and Africa, we should really focus on making sure that interoperability schemes include non-banks like mobile money and microfinance credit unions and cooperatives, because that's meeting the underbanked where they are. And so I think that's the major difference that I hope we see in Asia and Africa.